Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a concept that is, well, it's uncomfortable, but I think it's essential. It's the idea that the dysfunction you see in American democracy, the gridlock, the inability to solve these massive economic problems, the perpetual culture war, it isn't an acute illness, like a bad flu we can shake off.
It's chronic.
It's chronic.
Exactly. We are looking beyond the usual frame. When pundits and politicians talk about democracy being broken, they often point to these temporary breakdowns, a specific policy failure, the rise of a certain leader, or just hyper-partisanship. They treat it like a temporary moral or procedural error.
Right.
But what if the constraints are fundamental? What if they're baked into the institutional design and deeply connected to global economic power structures that, no amount of voting or well-meaning policy can easily overcome?
That is precisely our mission. We are examining the chronic nature of the crisis, the deep connections between global institutional incentives, the mechanics of economic globalization, and the resulting widespread feelings of low legitimacy, non-participation, and just political despair among the citizenry.
And to do that, we're using the work of political theorist Benjamin Studebaker to map these systemic constraints and understand why, for the average citizen who's just looking for material change, the way is shut.
Our source material is Studebaker's book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. And Benjamin Studebaker is a political theorist and commentator who approaches political economy from a structural rather than a, merely partisan perspective.
The context for this book is just so vital. It was written, post-2016, a period where public trust in American institutions just seemed to completely collapse.
It really did.
And suddenly, the political establishment on both the left and the right faced these massive internal challenges from figures like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And these movements, while they're culturally opposed, they shared a common root, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The profound failure of the American economy for the average working person. That was the core issue.
And this is where the system's defenders had to deploy a specific analytic maneuver. Studebaker argues that rather than engaging with the serious economic problems highlighted by populists, wage stagnation, debt, outsourcing, the professional and governing elites largely closed ranks.
They did. They avoided engaging with those economic issues because, acknowledging them would validate the entire populist critique of the system.
So how did they avoid that conversation? What was the move?
They set up a false dichotomy. They argued that the cause of populism wasn't actually economic insecurity, but rather pure cultural backlash. The logic went something like this. Since not all Trump voters were personally poor or unemployed, then economic factors couldn't possibly be responsible.
Therefore, it must be something else.
It has to be something else. The resentment must stem from cultural anxiety, racism, or tribalism. It's a neat way to sidestep the economic argument entirely.
I encounter this argument constantly, and it allows the elite to minimize the critique as just, mere bigotry or bad behavior, rather than confronting the consequences of their own economic policies over the last 30 or 40 years.
It serves a crucial function for maintaining legitimacy. And Studebaker, drawing on insights from thinkers like Joseph Stiglitz and Thomas Piketty, he forcefully counters this. He argues the economy and culture are, they're two sides of the same coin.
Of course.
When the system consistently fails to deliver material security or upward mobility, when the political system appears captured by moneyed interests, citizens don't just feel disappointed, they feel betrayed.
They start looking for a villain.
Exactly. Economic failure fuels irrational, powerful resentment. But since the real structural causes are so complex and, frankly, invisible, voters look for an understandable enemy. They conclude that the system is rigged by greedy, decadent, hateful elites, and then they look for cultural, often exclusionary solutions to what are fundamentally material economic problems.
And by denying that economic reality, by reducing the whole thing to just cultural backlash, the establishment just appears completely out of touch.
And that, ironically, validates the populists' claim that the establishment is part of the conspiracy against them. It's a feedback loop.
So this book, then, it isn't just addressing the symptoms. It's fundamentally challenging the intellectual frameworks we use to even debate the crisis.
It responds to two major ideological responses to this crisis. First, there's liberal reformism, which often focuses on these sort of managerial tweaks, better globalization management, minor tax reform, procedural changes.
Right.
This approach, Studebaker notes, it avoids challenging the structural economic power that makes globalization so devastating to labor in the first place.
It just nibbles around the edges without questioning the underlying engine.
Precisely. And the second camp is reactionary populism, which channels all that legitimate economic resentment into culture war narratives, focusing on immigration, identity, political correctness, instead of material reform like wealth redistribution or industrial policy. Neither of these dominant camps offers a credible path to fundamental change.
Okay, so let's unpack the core idea here. The central thesis is that American democracy is experiencing a chronic legitimacy crisis. It's chronic because all the quick, effective ways to resolve the deep economic resentment and restore faith in the system are blocked.
Blocked by institutional design, by gridlock, and by the unyielding leverage of global capital. The system is just stuck in this miserable, self-perpetuating equilibrium.
Let's dive into the mechanics of this blockage, starting with the biggest lever that global capital has over national democracy: capital mobility. I mean, we all know about free trade, but Studebaker shows that the ability of money and production to move instantly across borders is the actual constraint on democratic choice.
It is the political gravity of the 21st century. I mean, the decades-long drive toward globalization dismantled national economic barriers. To give you a concrete example, in 1970, the ratio of tariffs to imports was nearly 5 times higher than it was by 2017.
Wow.
Trade expanded from a fifth of our GDP to nearly a quarter, and this expansion is often discussed purely in terms of efficiency, but the political consequence is that capital gained veto power over national policy.
And most people focus on the visible results, the lost jobs. We know, for instance, that millions of American jobs were lost to the trade deficit with China in the early 2000s.
And that's the visible wound, but the real structural problem is the credible threat companies pose to relocate production, investment, and jobs overseas at a moment's notice.
So it's not just the action, it's the threat of action.
The threat is the political tool. Any government that proposes serious reforms, like steep corporate taxes, strong labor protections, or stringent environmental regulations, immediately faces the possibility of capital flight, which would crash their economy and guarantee they lose the next election.
So to attract or retain capital and jobs, governments end up in this race to the bottom. They're basically competing to offer the weakest labor laws and the lowest taxes.
Exactly. And this leads directly to policy capture designed to suppress wage growth and gut labor power. I mean, just look at the data. The inflation-adjusted federal minimum wage in 1970 was over $12 in today's dollars.
The math.
It's been stuck at $7.25 for years. Union membership, which was the primary mechanism for workers to secure a share of productivity gains, has plummeted from over 30% in the post-war decades to barely 10% today.
So even if the jobs stay in the U.S., the wages are systematically suppressed by that threat of relocation.
That's the key. And this constraint also systematically hollows out the tax system.
How so?
It turns it into Swiss cheese. Capital mobility allows wealthy individuals to stash trillions. Estimates range from $24 trillion to $36 trillion in offshore tax havens, effectively removing those funds from the public tax base. But perhaps even more impactful is the corporate tax erosion. Corporate income taxes, which accounted for nearly 32% of corporate profits in 1970, had fallen to just 10% by 2019.
And this trend is made even worse by competition at the state level, right?
Absolutely. The states compete fiercely to attract or retain corporations, primarily by offering massive tax breaks and direct subsidies. These subsidies are estimated to cost state and local governments somewhere between $45 and $70 billion annually.
That's a staggering amount of money that could be going to public services.
Schools, infrastructure, you name it. And now 9 states have no income tax at all, forcing them to rely on less progressive revenue sources.
So when revenue is systematically gutted at every level, federal and state, because governments are paralyzed by the threat of capital flight, the burden inevitably shifts onto those who can't move.
The working and middle classes. States cut public services. For example, average inflation-adjusted teacher salaries fell 4.5% between 2010 and 2019, and they increasingly shift the tax burden onto consumption.
So more sales taxes, sin taxes.
Exactly. Sales taxes, taxes on cigarettes or alcohol, and all sorts of fees. Wealth is agile, labor is weak, and the resulting fiscal consequences are downloaded onto the ordinary person. It's a beautifully designed system for transferring risk and cost away from wealth and onto labor.
This leads to the next conceptual problem. If real wages are barely growing, I think you said just 8% growth for the average worker between 1979 and 2019, while GDP soared by 760%. How do Americans continue to consume enough to keep this massive global economy churning?
This is the critical puzzle, and Studebaker relies on the economic sociologist Wolfgang Streeck's framework of the three fixes the government used to compensate for persistently low wages. The state, unwilling to mandate higher wages or challenge capital, had to find other ways to fund mass consumption.
Okay, so what was the first fix?
The Keynesian deficit state of the 1980s. When Reagan and subsequent administrations cut taxes on the rich and kept wages low, they funded consumption by running large federal deficits. The government borrowed massive amounts of money to maintain public spending and prop up demand.
So it was effectively the state borrowing money to help its citizens buy things.
You got it. But deficits can only grow so big before they become politically unpalatable.
So what was the shift in the 1990s?
That was the shift to the debt state. So instead of the government running up debt, the citizens were encouraged to borrow massively. This era saw the deregulation of financial markets, the proliferation of securitization, and easy access to mortgages and credit.
And it externalized the risk from the state to the household.
Exactly. It was an unstable system designed to extract interest payments from the working class, and it inevitably collapsed in 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis.
Which brings us to the third and current fix, quantitative easing, or QE.
Exactly. This is the central bank state. Since 2008, central banks and treasuries have been, for all intents and purposes, printing money or engaging in QE to keep interest rates near zero. This does two things. It makes the accumulated mountain of public and private debt sustainable, and it prevents the stagnant economy from tipping into dangerous deflation.
But I'm interested in why this particular fix leads specifically to greater inequality rather than just, general inflation.
Because QE systematically inflates the value of assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, which are overwhelmingly held by the wealthy. When the money supply expands and flows into financial markets, those who own those assets see their wealth surge without having to produce anything new.
And meanwhile, the working person.
The working person sees only slight wage increases, coupled with inflation in necessities like food, rent, and education. It's a political fix that keeps the economy moving, but only by fueling profound, visible inequality and creating perpetual asset bubbles.
And that profoundly challenges the legitimacy of the entire system.
It connects directly to the insights of Piketty. Democratic societies rely on the myth of the meritocratic worldview, the idea that success, and therefore inequality, is based primarily on talent, effort, and hard work, not on kinship or arbitrary luck. When economic change like massive asset inflation fueled by QE makes wealth accumulation seem arbitrary, the system's inequalities start to feel unjustified, even rigged. If the economy doesn't deliver on that fundamental promise of meritocracy, why should anyone believe the rules are fair? That's the legitimacy crisis taking root right there.
So we have a system fundamentally constrained by global capital, fueling debt, inequality, and this deep existential resentment. How does this structural pressure shape the political consciousness and behavior of different economic groups? Studebaker uses a simplified schema: workers, professionals, and small employers.
And we need to look closely at these internal class anxieties because the political system weaponizes these differences to prevent any kind of unified action.
Let's start with the workers. These are typically people without college degrees, largely pushed into low-wage, non-unionized service, retail, logistics, and hospitality roles.
Their political situation is one of increasing futility. The labor movement is devastated, and critically, their information sources are controlled by media outlets owned by wealthy oligarchs or staffed by the professional class, neither of whom share the workers' core economic interests.
So they recognize that the mainstream political and media establishment has no interest in explaining or fixing their declining quality of life.
None. And this is where we see the rise of conspiracy theories, not as purely irrational behavior, but as a response to the opacity of the system.
So it's a distorted form of rationality.
That's what Studebaker argues, that conspiracy thinking is a way for working people to try and understand why the country is becoming structurally cruel and unfair to them, especially when the established media refuses to provide a coherent, non-condescending explanation. They conclude that the system is captured, that hidden forces are operating against them.
But the problem is that this resentment is easily misdirected.
It's so easily misdirected onto outgroups, immigrants, cultural elites, specific political figures, instead of the complex structural forces that actually keep wages low and capital mobile. This misdirection pushes workers toward politics that further marginalize them, making them easier targets for manipulation by the oligarch class.
Okay, moving on to the professionals. They're defined by their college degrees and their reliance on a wage or salary. And their anxiety is driven by massive debt.
Education was sold as the guaranteed pathway to security, but it became a treadmill. Tuition costs have multiplied exponentially. I think it's a 40-fold increase at public colleges between 1975 and 2021. The average borrower owes upwards of $37,000.
That debt creates a form of indentured servitude.
It really does. You acquire massive debt just to secure wages that are often precarious, especially when, as the data shows, 1/3 of all graduates work in jobs that don't even require a degree.
That fear that the debt and the effort were a sham, that seems central to their political identity. And we need to distinguish between the two professional groups he talks about.
Yes. First, the rump professionals. These are the relatively secure, high-status positions, media executives, tenured academics, stable civil service workers. They work for the oligarchs or in institutions that are dependent on oligarchic wealth. They have an incentive to direct political resentment away from their employers.
And where do they redirect that resentment?
Onto cultural groups and, crucially, onto the working class and the other professionals. They monopolize public discourse with culturally charged anger and outrage, fueling antagonism between workers and other professionals, because that keeps the focus off the capital-labor relationship that defines their own position.
Then you have the fallen professionals. These are the people with advanced degrees who are stuck in precarious, low-paying jobs. The adjunct professor, the perpetually underemployed creative, the heavily indebted analyst.
They are experiencing proletarianization. They're being pushed down toward the working class, but they desperately cling to their university credentials, their cultural capital, to assert superiority and resist that downward pressure.
How do they do that?
They achieve this by mastering and using extremely niche, academic, and often alienating political language and virtue markers.
So the more esoteric the political discourse, the more it flatters their self-concept as educated people whose superior merit simply hasn't been rewarded yet.
Exactly. And Studebaker makes a powerful, if cynical, point here. The psychological need for this alienating language is so crucial to the fallen professionals' mental health and sense of self-worth that they will often prefer political defeat, ensuring the working class doesn't join their coalition, rather than abandoning their exclusive, status-defining discourse.
So they're structurally inhibited from communicating in a way that would build a broad political base for actual material reform.
They are. It's a tragic paradox.
And finally, the small employers. These are the local business owners, not the multinational oligarchs.
And their existence is defined by precarity. Unlike the anti-fragile oligarchs who can move capital globally and weather crises, the median small business has less than a month's worth of operating expenses on hand. They are tied directly to local economies, which are themselves stagnant because of low worker wages.
So they're caught in a contradiction. They need higher local wages for a stable customer base, but their own constant vulnerability makes them terrified of raising wages or paying more in taxes.
And this tension is expertly leveraged by the oligarchs through the political establishment and the media they own. Oligarchs frame their policy interests cutting corporate taxes, deregulation as protecting small business, even though the oligarchs' policies are the source of the small employer's vulnerability through wage stagnation and aggressive market consolidation.
What do they do?
Desperate to survive, many small businesses resort to illegal actions like wage theft, which steals an estimated $15 to $50 billion from American workers annually.
The bottom line, which connects all these classes, workers, professionals, small employers, is profound anxiety, dependence on powerful economic actors, and a sense that the rules of the game are rigged against them.
And that sets up the economic reality.
So now we have to ask the fundamental question the book poses. If the crisis is so pervasive, why is reform not just difficult, but seemingly impossible? Why is the way shut?
We must first put this inequality in historical perspective. The economic historian Walter Scheidel, in his book The Great Leveler, observed that once entrenched inequality takes root, it is incredibly difficult to roll back peacefully.
Right.
Historically, only massive disruptive shocks, what he termed the four horsemen of leveling, war, revolution, state collapse, or major pandemics, have managed to reduce wealth gaps significantly.
And the experience of the last few decades suggests that even those major shocks don't work anymore.
No, they don't. We saw massive shocks, the Iraq War, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and they failed to disrupt wealth accumulation. In fact, they accelerated it.
This is the concept of the anti-fragile oligarch.
Exactly. Because global supply chains remained operational and capital remained mobile, crises became opportunities for capital consolidation. While workers faced economic ruin during the pandemic, the stock market boomed, and tech and finance billionaires saw their net worth skyrocket. The system is structurally designed so that disruptions strengthen the most powerful actors.
So if the great historical disruptions only strengthen capital, then we have to look at the political paths. What about serious economic solutions?
Well, Studebaker analyzes why traditional political solutions, both global and national, are functionally impossible to implement. Take the multilateral approach, like Piketty's proposal for a global wealth tax to prevent those offshore tax havens.
This would require every major nation to agree and enforce it simultaneously.
Yeah.
Sounds difficult.
It requires the simultaneous election of reform-minded governments worldwide, a political impossibility, given the extensive, coordinated political mobilization by oligarchs in every country to prevent exactly that outcome. Even if a president signed such a treaty, it would face massive institutional hurdles and immediate legal challenges backed by unlimited funds.
So global coordination is a pipe dream. What about unilateral action, say? A president implements aggressive protectionism or strict capital controls to force investment back home.
The risk is devastating. Massive capital flight before the policy even takes effect. If a candidate campaigns on strict capital controls, every major corporation and financial institution will shift assets and production between Election Day and inauguration.
So the new president would inherit a collapsing economy.
A completely collapsing economy. Now, to avoid that capital flight, the president would have to spring it as a surprise without a democratic mandate.
Which would risk political collapse. You'd get immediate inflation, supply chain shock, a deep recession, all of which would turn public opinion against the surprise reformer, leading to a political crisis that would likely end the reform entirely.
And a gradual approach is equally doomed, as oligarchs use the time to lobby Congress to override the changes and move the remainder of their money. The threat of capital flight acts as a structural veto on any meaningful economic reform.
So the only politically feasible solutions are tokenistic.
Precisely. We see modest tax hikes proposed, but those are nowhere near what is structurally needed. To restore the income distribution that prevailed in the post-war era, the effective tax rate on the top 1% would need to be raised to an estimated 67.5%. The current top marginal rate is 37%.
Any hike approaching that 67% would trigger the capital flight and massive political mobilization that makes the policy unworkable.
The system is designed to reject necessary change while accepting token change to maintain the appearance of responsiveness.
Since the system cannot solve the underlying economic problems, it defaults to a state of stasis, the chronic legitimacy crisis. It doesn't collapse, it just locks up in this persistent gridlock that constantly frustrates the public.
The U.S. is trapped in what he calls minimal legitimacy. Citizens agree on the abstract idea that the system should be a democracy, but they fiercely disagree on the constitutional essentials, the basic structure, and what democracy actually means.
Half the country views the other side as illegitimate, not just wrong.
Right. And this disagreement turns political debate inward, away from substance.
It creates a highly meta-political environment.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of debating, say, healthcare policy or infrastructure, the debate centers intensely on procedures, election rules, campaign finance, the composition of the Supreme Court, who has the moral right to speak. Since the state cannot solve the underlying economic problems, people conclude the state is ignoring them because its procedures are dysfunctional or captured by the enemy group.
And this gridlock is fueled by institutionalized fear.
The fear is endemic. Every procedural reform suggested by one side, say campaign finance reform on the left or voter ID laws on the right, is immediately framed by the opposition as an existential authoritarian threat to democracy itself.
This fear forces these temporary unhappy alliances.
Exactly. The center-left against the populist right, the center-right against the progressive left, which makes substantive, cross-partisan cooperation on economic issues completely impossible. It's a mechanism for perpetual, debilitating deadlock.
And this fear-based gridlock seems to stem from a fundamental disagreement about the nature of authoritarianism itself.
Absolutely. We see two distinct competing fears. One is the fear of tyranny. the fear of a specific charismatic person or branch of government gaining too much arbitrary discretionary power, like a demagogic leader. The proposed response is to create impersonal rules and systems regulating social media, strengthening traditional institutions to check individual power.
But the other fear targets those impersonal systems themselves.
That's the fuel of totalitarianism. This is the fear of an impersonal bureaucracy, where power rests not with a tyrant but with an internal logic. Unaccountable AI systems, opaque corporate HR policies, or regulatory bodies that compels individuals to conform to structural imperatives.
And the response to that fear is?
To strengthen individuals or local groups to change those structural incentives, which often means weakening the larger institutional system.
So any reform designed to defeat tyranny looks totalitarian to those who fear impersonal systems, and vice versa. It's a perfect political paradox that guarantees gridlock.
It's the ultimate trap, and the final mechanism for maintaining this chronic crisis is the systematic lowering of expectations, achieved by watering down foundational political concepts within the educational and professional spheres. Legitimacy is restored not by solving the problem, but by defining political demands into oblivion.
Let's look at how liberty has been neutralized.
Liberty is predominantly reduced to negative liberty, the absence of external interference. This is often framed against a politically suspect positive liberty. By limiting the definition, the discourse successfully obscures the powerful classical concept of no dependence.
What does no dependence truly mean in this context?
It is the freedom from the arbitrary will or power of others. Think of the journalist who is never directly censored by the oligarch owner of their newspaper. But that journalist knows the owner has the power to fire them at any time.
That's the key.
That arbitrary power forces self-censorship. The journalist is dependent on the owner's goodwill. That is a profound loss of freedom. By focusing only on non-interference, our political discourse ignores the massive power relationships between employers and workers or capital in government, thereby making the question of economic dependence invisible.
Okay, moving to equality. The debate used to be opportunity versus outcome. Now it seems to be equality versus equity.
Yes, the term equality is now often framed as the simple, less sophisticated act of treating everyone the same, giving everyone the same-sized box to look over a fence. Equity is presented as the more advanced concept of equality of welfare, giving people what they need to achieve the same result.
But the move to equity, while it seems progressive, often imposes the least demanding definitions.
It does, and the radical edge is often taken off by pivoting towards group equity. This focuses on ensuring that a person's demographic, identity, race, gender, etc. no longer statistically predicts how one fares. This is an important goal, of course, but Studebaker shows that it risks masking the fundamental deep-seated class hierarchy.
Can you give us a concrete example of how group equity could be achieved without actually reducing that economic hierarchy?
Sure. Imagine we successfully achieve perfect racial equity in America. What Studebaker points out is that you could still have white and black workers equally exploited by white and black oligarchs. The class pyramid, the massive wealth concentration, and the systemic dependence of labor on capital would remain untouched and equally devastating for the working classes of all races.
So the intense focus on demographics, necessary as it is, effectively serves as a distraction from the core issue of hierarchical class systems and wealth concentration.
When power structures define the political words, you can't use the words to overcome power.
And finally, representation. How has this concept been diluted?
Representation used to be fundamentally about acting for constituents, the delegate or trustee models. But because the government's capacity to act for the people declines under the constraints of global capital and institutional gridlock, politicians increasingly comply with the impersonal incentives laid down by capital, regardless of voter wishes.
So they compensate by shifting to standing for.
They shift to descriptive representation, where the demographics of the representatives mirror the citizens, or symbolic representation. Politicians use cultural signifiers, talking points, ideological signaling, to appear to stand for their voters culturally, while being increasingly unable to act for them economically. This cultural discussion is an elaborate, necessary distraction, ensuring that regardless of who you elect, the systemic incentives remain unchanged.
This paints a deeply structuralist picture. The economic system is rigged, the institutions are locked in gridlock, and the language of change has been corrupted. So if voice political participation fails to change the dysfunctional system, how do citizens cope?
According to the economist Albert Hirschman, when voice fails, citizens resort to exit. Now, Since emigration is too difficult for most Americans and the economic problems are global, the most accessible form of exit is stopping political participation altogether.
So they just check out.
They check out. The political theorist Robert Goodin calls this settling politically despairing to free up time and energy for non-political life projects like family, career, or escapist hobbies.
So the average person rationally withdraws, saving their energy for the parts of life they can actually control.
Precisely. However, the political opposition parties, both the left and the right, cannot allow this large-scale settling to occur because they rely on voter participation to gain power. So they intentionally disrupt settling by constantly raising expectations with aggressive striving rhetoric.
Think of the powerful emotional appeals of Obama's hope and change, or Trump's "I alone can fix it."
Exactly. They promise fundamental structural change only to abandon those promises once in office when they confront the same institutional and economic constraints.
So they raise hope only to crush it, ensuring these continuous cycles of profound disappointment.
And that cycle keeps the public orbiting politics. The ruling party is forced to settle into centrist postures to manage the constrained economy, which opens a political space for the opposition party to promise radical striving. This continuous oscillation prevents citizens from achieving true political peace and maintains a constant, exhausting, yet controlled sense of crisis. The system sustains itself by continually disappointing the public.
That's a cynical take, but it really does fit the data. But if citizens try to retreat from politics into their private enclaves, they find those spaces are also constantly being infiltrated and politicized by professionals and corporations looking to reactivate them and monetize the manufactured conflict. These are the 4 Fs.
The first is faith. Spiritual spaces become political power bases. Televangelists, for example, have built lucrative careers by mobilizing evangelical Christians for conservative cultural causes. But we see progressive alternatives too. The point is, spiritual spaces are marketized and politicized, making faith an increasingly difficult refuge from conflict.
And our family. You can't even escape politics by focusing on your household stability.
No. Economic stress makes maintaining a stable family difficult. Wage stagnation means it's harder to run a single-earner household, and the resulting financial instability is cited by 68% of never-married adults as a reason they remain single.
And this leads to things like
Phenomena like the rise of the hikikomori severe social withdrawal, which is beginning to take root in the U.S. Attempts to shore up the family through things like affordable childcare or housing require the very economic reform that the political system fails to deliver. The system infiltrates the family by making it financially precarious.
the third F is fandoms. So you're saying I can't even watch sports or play niche video games without running into the same frustrating political gridlock we just described.
That's the core insight. Fandoms in sports have been politicized because they are profitable grounds for generating outrage and engagement. Professionals and corporations, particularly those tied to mass media, realize that cultural conflict drives clicks and views.
And you see this in the most obscure places.
Oh yeah, we see niche communities like the Creative Assembly Total War community drama he mentions, where disputes over historical representation or cultural signifiers in a video game blow up into massive politicized fights mirroring the larger societal culture wars.
And why do fans engage in this?
They engage in the motions of political action voice, exit threats, boycotts. But it's aimed at media corporations and creators, not public policy. These fandom disputes become a way of rehearsing the frustrating, unresponsive power relations that characterize formal politics, only aimed at a more immediate, though equally unyielding, target. It's impossible to hide from the conflict, even in escapist hobbies.
Finally, futurism. The hope of escaping politics through technology.
Futurism is the ultimate anti-political exit. It promises that private revelations, Musk's space plans, crypto AI companions, will overcome the political and economic obstacles that plague the government. Tech oligarchs are framed as non-political geniuses, capable of transcending systemic failures through sheer personal vision and technological acceleration.
They become the charismatic prophets of a godless age, offering a path forward that bypasses the sclerotic state entirely.
And this encourages the public to bet on acceleration rather than political action. Celebrities promote speculation on new financial products like crypto, promising quick wealth that solves the conundrums imposed by wage stagnation. This form of futurism is highly appealing because while the political system eternally disappoints and demands painful, unrewarding effort, The tech profits offer a mystique of immediate, effortless transcendence.
So if we link this back to our channel's focus on systems and perception, Studebaker's work really shows us why the political struggle is functionally locked.
It does. We have to realize that legitimacy is not stable when the core meaning of democracy is so intensely contested. We are locked into a procedural war where each side accuses the other of authoritarianism, tyranny versus totalitarianism, while ignoring the underlying shared economic sources of resentment.
And this war is sustained by manufacturing political despair.
Absolutely. The system checks madness with madness, creating these conflicting, unwinnable cultural wars, the battle over descriptive versus symbolic representation, or the endless linguistic shifts around equality and equity that push substantive economic issues to the margins and prevent unified class action.
The idea that the American populace is apathetic is a profoundly misleading conclusion drawn by the professional class.
Correct. The subaltern American population is not apathetic. They are deactivated. Their quiet disdain is a rational, calculated response to a system that cannot be moved and is demonstrably incapable of translating their voice into material action.
So democracy is described metaphorically as a succubus, a vampire, a leech on the energy of citizens.
Sustained by manufacturing hope and then dashing it, leading to generalized political despair that keeps the populace docile.
And that despair keeps them seeking solutions in those non-political enclaves, faith, family, fantasy, and futurism, which the system then infiltrates and marketizes, locking the cycle in place and preventing that energy from coalescing into a political force.
It's a stable, though miserable, equilibrium. The political establishment, regardless of party, is committed to maintaining the global economic order because they either believe in its necessity or, more crucially, they see no politically survivable alternative. Any attempt at radical change risks disturbances to the economy that would result in their immediate political collapse.
This book compels us to view the crisis not as a temporary failure of morality or personality, but as a systemic equilibrium maintained by the unyielding power of global capital and institutional design. The blockage is not imagined, it is real.
And it forces us to question the value of incremental or tokenistic reforms. Legitimacy cannot be restored through merely changing the political language, fighting over liberty, equity, or representation, or through modest tax hikes or campaign finance tweaks. The system attempts to renew itself by eating our dreams, turning our highest ideals into the lowest standards it can persuade us to accept.
Power defines the words, and only a shift in power can redefine them.
That's right.
So the argument raises these really difficult questions about the potential paths forward. Given the extreme difficulty of implementing any non-tokenistic economic reforms and the high cost of challenging the anti-fragile oligarchs, what is an active, engaged person who desires change supposed to do?
The author details that any effective political challenge would require a massive, expensive effort. Potentially a para-party movement funded by a combination of oligarchic class traders, the few rich individuals willing to work against their own class interests, and a massive revitalized labor movement which currently lacks the coherence and resources to compete.
And even if such a movement materialized, it would face overwhelming, coordinated opposition that would frame it as authoritarian at every turn.
At every single turn. Ultimately, the analysis returns to Scheitel's brutal observation. Once entrenched inequality sets in, only massive destructive shocks have ever reduced it. And since we, as a civilization, cannot countenance wars, state collapse, or revolution, the very things necessary to force dynamism, the way is shut.
And this leads to the final haunting reflection.
It does. It uses the metaphor of the paths of the dead. The path to radical change is blocked because it requires countenancing unthinkable destruction. Max Weber once described the fate of the truly politically musical person in a godless and profitless time, a time when we know the profit we yearn for simply does not exist. The challenge, then, is what it means to remain committed to politics, to remain musical when you know the way is shut, and that your efforts might only sustain the very system you seek to destroy by providing it with managed, predictable opposition. It is a profound, tragic question for our era.
We have been deep diving into the chronic crisis of American democracy, The Way is Shut, by Benjamin Studebaker.
We encourage you to read the book, support the author, or borrow it from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.